Welcome to the far future of the Orion Arm, where stellar systems are mined and sold, you can print a mech, and there are mega corporations the size of interstellar empires. Hi, hello, and welcome back to our favorite mech tabletop RPG, Lancer, where today we're going to be discussing some of the background stuff, you know, kind of like the Humans Plus video. We're going to be talking about the resources, the manufacturing, the licenses, and printing, which is more directly related to you as Lancers and the GM running the game. Because we bring it up a lot, both the book and the mechanics, and in all of the license videos, it's almost like it's a core part of the game. But what exactly are those things in lore and in setting, and how are the Karakin trade baronies actually manufacturing all these things? What is Union building? How are blink gates constructed? How do you go from a diasporan world to a core world? What's it like on a core world? This post-scarcity talk. That's kind of a lot, so we're actually going to start with the thing that most of you relate to, both as GM and player: printers and licenses. So what are the exact nature of printers? Well, that's actually a looser definition. There isn't a single type of thing that is considered a printer. I mean, there is under Union's classification, but the word is thrown around a ton. Basically anything that partially auto-fabricates. You know, an advanced 3D printer, a car factory could kind of be considered one. The big thing with the printer is it's also processing the raw materials you're putting into it in some manner. You know, the fancy sci-fi printers. That's kind of what separates the loose definition of printers to the actual printers you're going to be using for mech chassis and large-scale things. Because there are things closer to like modern 3D printers, or even like portable ones you can bring and carry with you, or handheld ones. If you have the right chip, license, print, or just whatever you got from the OmniNet, you likely can make it. You know, something on the scale of a microwave, or you can have it in an office, or even handheld backpack that you can fold out. But all those smaller scale ones are much more limited in what they can actually process. Like, they're still technically classified as a printer, even if they are like a modern 3D printer. As in, they can only handle plastics or specific materials that are very flexible and moldable, or custom made to be used with said printer. When you get up to the proper fancy printers, it can handle almost any material. It will do the processing needed for the fabrication on the spot in the printer. And that is the black box component of a printer. It's the paracausal side of it, because every proper scale printer is paracausal. That's where the loose definition comes in. You have the regular, what we would consider regular printers on the smaller side, and then when you actually get up to Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, and the loose Schedule 4, that's where paracausal comes into it. This strange bit of alchemy that's on the inside of the printer, going from the A to Z process of the raw material going in, and then the proper state it needs to be in when assembled. So that's the big thing. It's not Star Trek fabricators. It's not pressing a button and electricity's manufacturing some kind of molecule out of nothing. Energy to matter, it's not that. In fact, it takes a ton of energy to actually run a printer. But you still need the raw resources put into it. There's still mundane construction in the form of all the robotic arms and the actual printing. Fancy part about it is the paracausal function, where you just have to get the resource to the printer. It will do the rest. Past that paracausal point, if you have the resources, you just need the license and the energy. Now, we'll touch on licenses after the actual printers themselves, but when it comes to the actual sizes of mech you're going to be using and those types of printers, you have the schedules. This is the actual Union classification, starting at Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, Schedule 3, and then the loose, larger scale Schedule 4, with 1 being the most common, 2 being the second most, 3 being a bit rare, and 4 being heavily specialized for a particular type of construction, usually something of a ridiculous scale. And it does follow with those size categories of chassis. So if you need a rough image of your head on what size those are, a Schedule 3 needs to be able to hold a Barbarossa in it. Same thing with Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Size 1, Size 2. So first, your Size 1 printers, the scale of 14 square meters or 150 square feet, and that's for printing your Size half and Size 1 mechs, usually taking around 2 to 8 hours, you know, depending on the scale. Schedule 2 is large enough to the point that it's usually built as its own structure, so you know, like a small warehouse or barn. Not quite literally, but you know, it's an enclosed space. You know, proper facility, and usually requiring of 2 to 4 people to man it. Printing something of Size 2 in a Schedule 2 usually takes 10 hours. Anything smaller usually takes from 2 to 4 hours. Schedule 3, you're now actually getting on the rare side, and beginning to stretch the definition of printer even before we get to Schedule 4. You're leaning more into factory here. So again, just a reminder, Schedule 3 needs to be able to hold a Barbarossa in it. But it's a large complex, probably a proper warehouse or building, requiring a full team of operators, partly due to the fact it has multiple printers inside of it. It isn't just one printer at this point. You have multiple workbenches, automated stations, separate printers printing smaller components and details. This is where you're beginning to stretch the definition of, the printer. This is more a factory, though it is all designed to work with each other and follow one print. And something of this scale is a big investment, usually reserved for construction, industrial equipment or machinery, and military applications. Constructing something small up to a Size 3 can take anywhere from minutes, due to all the smaller printers and other stations, to days for Size 3. That Barbarossa is taking a while to print. Now we move on to Schedule 4, and just like Schedule 3 was already beginning to stretch the definition of single printer, it's pretty much an automated factory with printers in it, and doesn't have a consistent size. It's not like, oh, it just holds Size 3 Schedule 4 is very built to purpose, namely reserved for orbital applications, so things where you need to build parts of ships and stations, or smaller vessels. Subline vessels can be entirely printed inside a Schedule 4, and pretty much everything from the size 3 scaled up, so even larger crew, even more printers and workstations, and reserved for even bigger projects, everything in space, ships, parts of them, stations, and megastructure projects, though usually not printing them out all on their own, just different components. Anything past Schedule 4, you're just going to need a team of people to construct. You can construct large structures as single objects from a printer, but at a certain point to put all those pieces together, you're going to need a crew. Not to mention the things that are limiting printers. Again, that resource, the instability of that paracausal element, the massive power draw, and the licensing. With resources, we're going to save that when we talk about the resources of the Orion arm and how that's being managed and handled. I'll actually start with the power draw. Not that big of an issue in Union. Again, each of your mechs has a cold fusion reactor on board, a miniaturized one. Power isn't really an issue. It just proves that it can be an issue if you're on a diasporan world, or in places limited in tech. To that paracausal bit inside of the printer, that unstable part of it. Unstable. It is stable, it's just not as stable as, just repairing a robotic arm with a mechanic. That's a very sensitive piece of equipment in there. It's bending reality, or ignoring it. And it's kind of the core function of a printer to revert those raw materials into what you need. While not quite the same, but actually pretty close, I would recommend looking at Prey, and their printers, the blocks of raw resources that you just place inside and then it knows how to use them. Again, once you have the design or the print. But I keep calling it unstable because it's something you can actually lose. An example in Solstice Reign, and just talked about in other parts of Lancer, you can have a backslide in technology, especially with big events going on in the Orion arm, or just no one having the knowledge of the printer, it having been provided to the colony, but no one being specialized or having the resources or OmniNet connection to understand it. Then one day it breaks, and that's it. You now have to go back to regular manufacturing. If all your printers break, you're industrially sent back to the 21st century. And now for that final bit, licenses, that fourth component to have a printer actually work for you. Resources, paracausal alchemy, power, and licenses. So what does your license level actually mean to you, and to just your average citizen? Well, it means access to print and access to software that's going to be used in that print, or that equipment. A lot of this is actually biologically keyed, so if you're entering something on the OmniNet, it's not a code that you have to use, it is a biological tag, probably thrown in with some kind of code and software to make sure it's actually you where you are. Something highly secured. Something so secure that if you're looking at Star Sector, if the OmniNet went down, that's not that inaccurate, not too far off. But outside of being the actual information for the print and access to the software, some licenses it can act as your key to using said software, or hardware. So as you're going into your chassis, piloting and hooking up to it, it might be seeing if you are the actual pilot or have access to said license or use of said weapon. So if you were a pilot that randomly hopped in an ally's chassis, there's a chance loose, but it might not work. This is one of those gray area points within the lore on how exactly a license works. Is it limiting just to the prints, or is it also limiting the operation? And then from some of the lore tabs, it could be limiting the operation, but there's also examples of it not. But when it comes to the software, that is usually something restricted. This is also one of the things that stops you from just scavenging materials off of other mechs or chassis. You can make things for repairs, but you can't take whole weapons and systems that are following, let's say, a Harrison license. If you hook it up, wire it all together, you go into the cockpit, there's a chance that you don't match that license, the weapon won't work. Even if mechanically it's all attached and functioning, leading to some pirates, bandits, outlaws making things like Frankenmechs, using hardware to get around the software, and it having similar flaws to Frankenmechs. There's probably going to be an asterisk here somewhere. The main thing the license restricts, though, is what you can actually print. And it's not just giving you access to those licenses, it's whether you have access to the general stuff in the first place. Because yes, GMS is available to everyone, Union still restricts prints. When you can print weapons, it's usually because you're seen as an auxiliary or a mercenary or someone who's working for some kind of larger force, giving you access to that role. You are a militant role. But if you are said pirates or rebels, Union's going to cut you off. In fact, they're not going to really allow it in the first place for you to print any of that. Which is another point Horus is kind of upset with Union. In fact, speaking of Horus, there's a good example with them of working around licenses and printers. That being the Kobold, which is actually information usually shared physically and not printed. Yes, there's an example of the Kobold being printed and you can technically get prints for it, but the way it was designed was so you could get around Union printers. So you'd find some kind of just industrial machinery, a smaller scale industrial mech, and with that code in hand, you would install the software for the chassis and embedded in that software instructions on how to modify it. So that way you can make a Kobold, which is why the earlier forms of the Kobold had a high lethality rate for its pilots, and still have a potential lethality rate. Inconsistent design. And when it comes to your games and what a license level actually is, it could be reputation, it could be connections. I usually represent getting a license level with an actual member or representative of one of the megacorps, getting a good graces with them, which is why why the core bonuses are actually, withheld unless you have 3 licenses in those manufacturers. Special access to favored clients. But the ways you actually get a license level are loose enough that it's whatever fits your campaign. But now that we've talked about the licenses and printers, we're getting into the galactic scale industry. First thing to keep in mind, scale. And then the second thing to keep in mind, union. Namely the 3 pillars in that regard. That one's gonna throw a wrench into things. Because what I've seen in some other comments is, if this is the true scale of what union is capable of, or the hegemony, the things listed and the new prosperity agreement and what the character and trade baronies can do, why is it so limited? Why is the diaspora not full of core worlds everywhere? So a lot of calculations for building of megastructures and grand projects are kind of assuming the best case scenario, but in real life, even on just our earthly scale or city scale or single individual town project, over time, over budget, and something going wrong. Now multiply that to the scale of entire stellar systems. Not everything goes immediately right or according to plan. Nothing really runs at 100% efficiency. That being said, it is still a large scale. The wealth of resources of the Orion Arm and everything kept within the hegemony and traded. All of that helping and fueling the post-scarcity talked about on Union core worlds. This is due to the abundance of electricity, abundance of resources, abundance of printers, abundance of food. Like, you just have such a glut of abundance around core worlds, you worry for nothing. You want for nothing. And part of what's fueling this is that new prosperity agreement with the Carrick and trade baronies. On top of that being Union's expansion as well. But not all of it. There is still mining, there is still industry within and around the systems of core worlds. And on core worlds. The issue with Union and why they can't keep up with the Carrick and trade baronies or some of the megacorps is those pillars. All work in core worlds is entirely voluntary. That's one tick against industry. 2 is restrictions on AI and automation. Not necessarily directly coded into law, it might be on some worlds within Union, but ever since the Siege of Mars, the hegemony, anyone in the hegemony, hasn't really been at ease on using mass-scale automation. Even after raw and vulnerabilities of people hacking and abusing it, there are still the chances, even if minimal, if you kept up with cycling, of an NHP cascading. And while yes, reality-bending, terrifying things, the first thing that goes is anything digital. That's all going to the NHP. Which is why, similar to mechs and ships, you have human pilots, you have human managers basically looking after a small automated force or a fleet of drones, but nothing on too large of a scale that could be abused through hacking or an NHP going wrong or cascading. It's seen as a vulnerability and hazard. Now, there might be some Union core worlds that have different laws or regulations around this, so they might have higher scaling, but just overall within the entire setting of Lancer, AI isn't fully given everything to do. There's a voluntary limit on what most people automate, or feel comfortable automating. So when it comes to Union's industrialization, those two bits really hurt it. Again, still massive, still inherited a good chunk of what Setcom had, but it goes against the pillars to have some kind of forced labor, or even paid labor. If you're joining the Union Navy, if you're joining some kind of bureaucratic force within Union, or if you're wanting to basically go out and mine something, it's because you want to. No one in Union is going to be forcing anyone from a core world. Not to mention, if you're in a core world, you're not getting paid. Again, the pillar. This has left some Union systems not fully exploited, in fact a good chunk of them. And that's where diasporan territories, interstellar empires and republics, the megacorps and the Carrick and trade baronies go ahead. You know, they don't need to worry about that pillar. Some of them might have a different feeling about AI and automation and might be fully automated, potentially having some kind of gray swarm going out and automating an entire system, stripping it bare. Oh, before I forget, one of the other things that's holding Union back a bit, because even still, with those specifications and those self-placed limitations, over time, they'd still be able to, fit their own output, not have to rely on the new prosperity agreement as much. The fact that Third Com only recently got things under control. I say recently, it's still a century, but yes, the civil war over some of the core worlds and prime locations within Union was fought over that period of time. As talked about in No Room for Wallflower, it was centuries of still cleaning up the diaspora and other elements of Setcom. Another 2 centuries have managed to actually put everything back together, and it's only been roughly over a century where they can actually do things, new projects, actively building, not just reclaiming or rebuilding. It's only a century ago they got back to where Setcom was. And that's not even entirely true, because there's a lot more independent systems which Setcom used to have a hold over. But other than that, that's just to explain why Union isn't mass-producing core worlds immediately. It's why they're still buying and ordering things from Harrison Armory, IPS-N, resources from the KTB, relying on that new prosperity agreement. But they are catching up. That is one of the other tensions between the KTB and the Union. It's the worry that Union won't need to rely on the Carrick and trade baronies, or one of these other megacorps is going to step in where the KTB was. Which, speaking of the Carrick and trade baronies, and potentially Harrison Armory, these other manufacturers, when it comes to resources, the scale and investment. Because the scale doesn't just go on, raw tonnage, volume. It also goes in time, in said investment, not in a monetary one, but everything. The resources, the manpower. On our scale of a single world, you could look at a factory and say, okay, maybe you can get rid of that. It'll cripple an enemy enough that you can move in and you can rebuild it later. But some factories and stations, things like harbors, you might want to use yourself. Now scale that up to where it took centuries to build an arcology or a space station or an entire orbital ring. You're not gonna blow that up. This was the advantage the Karrakin trade baronies had when it came to FirstCom bumping to their door. They had a building up, they had a head start, they had a lead. And one over the past few thousand years they haven't quite lost yet. But that was the importance of the interest wars. It's not just for raw resources of these planets. One of the big things fought over during the interest wars was Union foundry worlds. Seccom worlds that were basically entire factories. Who knows how many printers, proper automated factories to build larger structures or entire assembly lines making armies. During the interest war and Union scrambling to put everything back together, you had Second Committee's entire military industrial base up for grabs. It wasn't just planets with resources or systems that had some kind of promising mining attached to it. It was the factories, it was the colonies that were already there, it was the thousands of year-old planets and populations. That workforce, that skilled labor, that location, that investment, that entire galactic hegemony had invested in, you could grab. Karrakin trade baronies wanted this to renegotiate with ThirdCom, taking more of their industrial base that they lost from Seccom, and Harrison I saw it as simply reclaiming Second Committee resources. At the end of the interest war, Harrison got those foundry worlds and claim on the purview, and the Karrakin trade baronies got the gold mine that was the Dawnline Shore, which also already had some early colonies placed on it. But it's the potential an investment in that system could make, and the raw resources. And it's not just Harrison Armory or the Karrakin trade baronies holding on to this. SSC has specific deals with people within the Karrakin trade baronies, you know, getting particular materials, those fancy forges, artisanal crafts, that fine, artistic, and expensive touch. While they don't have entire worlds and systems plundered for raw materials, they do still exploit those. But most of those constellar worlds are for the investment of the people, of the genetics, the populations. The people are the value in SSC. Then you look over at IPS-N. They're not on any core world. Cosmopolitan space doesn't receive core world status. And especially you go into interstellar space or out in the diaspora, IPS-N has some good chunk in mining investments in asteroid belts on other worlds. Station with a bit of an IPS-N investment, probably taking raw resources from it. And then the trade itself to systems that haven't quite mined or had access to mine the resources or exploit their own stellar systems. That's where you have a train of IPS-N vessels or other massive shipments coming from other systems that already do have that infrastructure for mining. Again, the Karrakin trade baronies. Not just their concern, but their interest. There's other private territories where they have ownership, where those pillars can be ignored and the system and the people exploited. Not to mention any of the countless independent diasporan systems. Individual stations, the Long Rim. There are still massive projects, there are still megastructures, there are still stations everywhere. Interstellar industry, entire stations to build more stations. Capital ships, freighters, blink gates. There is still industry going on, there are still massive projects being done, there are still entire systems being exploited for their resources. It's just that ThirdCom doesn't quite do it like any of the other factions. And that's where some tension comes up. I don't just mean with some of the other factions, though that is true, on who has ownership of what, other resources, private property being a thing outside of core worlds. The new prosperity agreement on how much the Union relies on the Karrakin trade baronies, but even within Union itself, there's disagreement on what they're doing, on what they should be doing. Both in response to their own citizens, should certain labors be required? How much should Union rely on outside forces for their materials, for their licenses, for their designs? Yes, they have GMS, but they still buy licenses and contracts from these other manufacturers, and all the resources from the new Prosperity Agreement, something ThirdCom still relies upon, even though that was something Seccom committed to. It's that chain, that fourth bit of power, that Union doesn't quite have a hold of yet. Thank you for watching the video on this very loose subject. Industry, scale, massive shipments. It's something that we've mostly covered actually in the Karrakin trade baronies and talking about some of the other manufacturers. This was more of the printing and license video. What exactly is going on with the printer? Can you lose access to it? And when it came to the resources, that's more just a very broad discussion. Hard to talk about specific examples when there aren't really any, because it's broad sweep stuff. It's, okay, post-scarcity on Union core worlds, new prosperity agreement, all the crazy resource extraction the Karrakin trade baronies do, and the other megacorps are doing that as well, and why the interest war was so pivotal. Because Union didn't get access to those worlds. It was between Harrison Armory and the Carrick Trade Baronies. ThirdCom doesn't own those. When you're talking of investments of billions of people, thousands of years, and the raw resources and tonnage of entire stellar systems. Oh, throw in a printer on top of that? Man. There's potential to build crazy things, and a ton of things. Potential that it's not Union's goal. And that might bite it, as some interest groups in the committee worry about. Ooh, also, final bit, didn't really have a place to put it, but the examples in the book of someone strapping regular cannons to a chassis, because the weapon was long forgotten or they couldn't make the ammunition for it. Basically a fallen back to a feudal era world that had chassis for the initial colonization, but no access to printers, they lost it. The generator is still partially functioning, it's just they don't have any ammo or weapons, it's falling apart. You can get some crazy mechs in other fights. Franken-mechs, very possible. Once again, thank you for watching the video, a thank you to my patrons, and have a nice day.